Gentleman is recognized until 10 p.m.
I thank the Speaker. Ask unanimous consent that all members be allowed 5 days to file remarks, revise, and extend those remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this Sunday, May 29th, marks one-year anniversary for the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act being signed into law, or a JVTA as we refer to it. This is a vital piece of legislation that the House and Senate passed, signed by the President a year ago, that takes this scourge of human slavery that's taking place internationally but also here in the United States, and Congress weighs in on this to deal with this issue, and I think in a very good way. And it's impressive to me as a member of the House how many members of Congress on both sides were involved in drafting legislation over a year ago that came to the House and passed. In the House itself, there were 11 pieces of legislation dealing with trafficking, sex trafficking. And all of those bills came up to the House floor the same week. All of them passed with overwhelming numbers, went down the hallway to the U.S. Senate. The Senate combined those bills into one bill, passed that legislation. It came back to the House. We passed that, signed by the President. And I want to thank all those members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who worked on this. Just by way of background, I got involved in this issue several ways. One way was when I was in Eastern Europe several years ago and found out about human trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking that was taking place in Eastern Europe, and how young women were lured into thinking they were going to get a better job or have a job in Africa, and next thing they knew, they were in sex slavery in northern Africa. Most of those women just disappeared over the years. And then back here in the United States, we have the problem of the crime and the scourge of trafficking, and it happens in two areas. There's international sex trafficking into the United States. About 20% of the trafficking here in America is international, primarily coming from the southern border. You see those drug traffickers, those drug dealers that come across the southern border, Texas. They bring anybody into the United States, and they do anything for money. And they will bring young girls, young women, and traffic them into the United States, turn them over to criminal gangs like the MS-13 gang, and then they're trafficked throughout the United States. That's about 20% of the trafficking. But the other 80% is trafficked by domestic, where young girls, young women are trafficked throughout the United States. The same crime, sex slavery, sex trafficking. And I had the opportunity to meet a lot of these trafficking victims in my work as chairman, co-chairman with Jim Costa of the Crime Victims Caucus. I'll tell you about three of those, and those three people, those three women, helped get the mind straight of members of Congress on this issue that's taking place. T was, as her nickname is, was in foster care, and she spent 18 years of her life in foster care. In foster care, she was abused, treated like an animal, hardly fed by some of the individuals that were in the foster care system. And all she wanted was a family, someone to love and care for her. She met an older boy, and that individual made her feel special, promised he loved her, take care of her. But soon as she left with him, she became a sex slave, and her innocence was crushed. She was sold around the country in massage parlors, strip clubs, and hotels, and on the internet. She was treated like property for 7 years, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned that she was in foster care. We now understand that about 2/3 of trafficking victims, sex trafficking victims in the United States, somewhere in their life they were in foster care. That's an issue we have to deal with. Congress has to deal with that. But finally, T was rescued, and now she tells her story wherever she can, and even Time magazine featured her and her life and her story and her recovery. Brooke Axtell, I met in Texas, and her mother was extremely ill when she was about 7 years of age, and so the mother turns Brooke over to a nanny, but the nanny did not protect her. In fact, the nanny did just the opposite. The nanny sexually abused Brooke and then trafficked her. And it's common with child trafficking victims, Brooke was also a victim of child pornography. After Mom gets out of the hospital, Brooke was slow to tell Mom what happened, but she finally did. And working with her mother, she was able to be rescued and get out of this scourge of sex trafficking. And now she works with Allies Against Slavery in Texas. The third person I want to mention very briefly is Cheryl Briggs. She grew up in an abusive home. She was sexually abused by her father. Things were so bad in the home that Mama left when Cheryl was very young and to escape the abuse. But at the age of 12, Cheryl didn't know what else to do except get away from her father, so she ran away. She began hitchhiking with truck drivers, anybody who would take her, led her to get involved with a motorcycle group, and she started a career, unfortunately, in sex trafficking hell. This individual took her to a biker club filled with men who sexually assaulted her. They raped her, and she became a trafficked victim. She was forced to do all kinds of just awful, horrible things. She was trapped in this scourge of human trafficking and didn't know how to get help. She was finally able to get help when a patron of the strip club figured out on his own that she was too young and helped her get rescued, and now Cheryl works with helping those who are in this trafficking, sex trafficking in the United States. Those are just three stories, Mr. Speaker. And so what we did, and let me tell you about one bill, and then I want other members of Congress who are here at this late hour to make comments as well. Carolyn Maloney and I worked on Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. Now, you know Carolyn Maloney. She is a New York liberal Democrat that talks a little funny. And she teamed up with me, a Texas conservative that talks a little funny, according to her. And the two of us got together and started working on this with lots of members of Congress, and the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, thanks to the hard work of Ms. Maloney and others, and especially the women in the U.S. House of Representatives, passed the House, and it does three things. It goes after the trafficker, the slave master, and makes sure that when prosecutors, Mr. Speaker, as you know about prosecutors, when they get to prosecute those cases, that person goes away to the penitentiary, the Do-Right Hotel, for as long as the judge can send them. Then it goes to the other end and looks at the trafficking victim. And for years, society looked at this victim as a criminal, a child prostitute. Children cannot be prostitutes. It's impossible, legally impossible. So rather than treat them like criminals and put them in the criminal justice system, it rescues those victims and treats them like victims of crime rather than criminals. A major change in society's thought and thought process about these children and young women. But also, Mr. Speaker, it goes after the money, the consumer, the buyer, in the middle. Too long, these buyers of trafficking victims to pay money to do these awful things to children have kind of skated under the criminal justice system. Not anymore. Those days are over. The days of boys being boys are over. And these buyers can be prosecuted to the same extent of the law as the trafficker. So the bill does three things. It goes after the trafficker, goes after the demand, the money, rescues the victims. And how do we pay for this? Kind of a novel approach. Federal judges now can impose fines and fees on the trafficker and the buyer, because a lot of them have a lot of money, and that money goes into a fund, and that fund is used and given as grants for different organizations, nonprofits throughout the country and states to help trafficking victims and also to educate police and educate the public. So it's a good piece of legislation. And that was just one of several pieces of legislation that came to the House floor. I do want to recognize, as I told you, this was bipartisan, and Ms. Joyce Beatty is here from Ohio. she filed legislation called the Improving the Response for Victims of Child Sex Trafficking. All of that legislation was included in the Senate bill and came back to the House and then passed. And what it does is decriminalize child sex and make it easier for people to report potential incidences of crimes against children. So I'd like to yield to her 5 minutes on this issue, a great advocate on behalf of crime victims and trafficked victims. And I'll yield to the lady.
Thank you so much, Judge Poe. To my colleague, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank Judge Poe, Chairman of the Victims' Rights Caucus and representative of Texas's 2nd Congressional District, for organizing this evening's important special order hour and for all of his hard work on behalf of the victims of human trafficking. I'm also very pleased to have the opportunity to partner with my good friend, Congresswoman Ann Wagner of Missouri, and my classmate, and a friend who we share the same priority of eradicating human trafficking. Kind of odd as Judge Poe talked about his relationship with Carolyn Maloney, two people who seem on paper very different. One might say the same about Ann Wagner and I. But Mr. Speaker, there is that common thread that puts us together to not only advocate and fight for something that we need to fight for, but we've been able to make a difference. And that is why I come to the House floor this evening to recognize and celebrate a very important anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of bipartisan comprehensive legislation, Justice for Victims Trafficking Act, that was signed into law. The Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, or JVTA, was a landmark bill, as you've heard, that updated Americans' effort to combat the scourge of human trafficking and provided essential resources to survivors and law enforcement officials. I am so proud to have had my bill to be included in this legislation and to have been able to take part in its drafting, passage, and enactment. Mr. Speaker, in the year since JVTA's enactment, we have witnessed important achievements. For example, the JVTA has reinvigorated Americans' commitment to protecting our children from cruel exploitation. And Mr. Speaker, these children still need our protection. Human trafficking, as we've heard, is an estimated multi-billion-dollar a year international enterprise that forces the most at risk among us, both here at home and abroad, into modern-day slavery. It is one of the fastest-growing crimes in the world. According to the United States Department of human trafficking is amongst the world's top 3 criminal enterprises. It is forced prostitution, domestic slavery, and forced labor, which is why enactment and now the implementation of the JVTA is so important. We must continue to work to eradicate human trafficking and support the victims. In the years since the JVTA's enactment, we have seen educators, law enforcement officials, service providers working together, Democrats and Republicans, Mr. Speaker, raising awareness in our communities that human trafficking is not merely an international phenomenon. It unfortunately happens all too often in our backyards. Just as we have heard Judge Poe talk about T and talk about Brooke, and the stories could go on and on. In fact, in my home state of Ohio, for example, each year an estimated 1,000 children become victims of human trafficking, and over 3,000 more are at risk. Ohio is the 5th leading state for human trafficking because of its proximity to ways that lead to an international border and I-75 interstate that allows anyone to exit the state within 2 hours to almost anywhere. Lastly, I am very thankful for having amazing advocates in Ohio for victims of human trafficking, like Teresa Flores, the founder of SOAP, Save Our Adolescents from Prostitution, and State Representative Teresa Fetter, who has made a lifetime commitment, a member of the Ohio House of Representatives, working to protect our victims. We must remain vigilant in the implementation of JVTA as we were when we passed it, so every child, every woman and man is free from this form of modern-day slavery, which is why I am proud to have joined Judge Poe and Congresswoman Wagner and Maloney of New York in leading a letter to the United States Attorney General Loretta Lynch supporting the Department of Justice's implementation thus far of the JVTA and requesting needed information on what more can be done within the confines of the current law. Mr. Speaker, this is what happens when we work together. This is a great example of what we can do when Democrats and Republicans come together to change lives, and that's just the way it is.
I thank the gentlelady. I like your tagline. I might use it myself. You point out several good things, and I think that everybody listening can understand why legislation like this got passed, because of your passion. And I'll say again, because of the women in the U.S. House that pushed this last year and were relentless until all this legislation came up. You point out many good things. There's two things, though, that I want to point out myself that you mentioned about the money. People may ask, Mr. Speaker, why is this, there's so much money involved in this? Well, drug dealers, when they sell drugs, you sell drugs one time, and the cost of apprehension, the consequences are great, and the chances of getting caught are great. On the other end, you have sex trafficking, and unfortunately, these children are sold multiple times a day, sometimes 20, 25 times a day. And the risk of getting caught is very low, and the punishment up until now has been very low. And so that is why it is the second or third biggest monetary system of criminal enterprises anywhere. That, Mr. Speaker, in itself is a disgrace to us as a people to allow this to happen, where slavery is second or third money maker for the criminal gangs out there that primarily run all of these enterprises. I want to yield 5 minutes to another gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber. He's been in the anti-trafficking movement a long time. He worked in the Texas legislature and helped Texas get ahead of the curve on the movement before we actually did here in the House. And so I want to yield to the gentleman from southeast Texas, Mr. Weber, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Judge. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to be here and to work in a bipartisan fashion across the aisle for this very worthwhile cause. I will tell you, the judge is exactly correct. In Texas, we like to say that things were bigger in Texas. And unfortunately, Texas has one record that we really didn't want, and that is that we have 25% of the sex trafficking in the country. We're one of 50 states, and yet we had 25% of that, the victims of sex trafficking going on right there in Texas. We were able to pass House Bill 4009, which did a number of things. It actually instructed police, the enforcement officials, to take a look at some of these girls, these young girls that are being picked up, and I guess for that matter, young men as well, and to not just assume that they were willfully participating in the sex trade, but to look deeper into the background there. And some of these children, some of these girls, we found out, Judge, were actually held against their will and were drugged and beat into submission. some as young as 12, that were dancing in some of these strip clubs, and like you said, some of the patrons would take notice of that and it would actually get them help. So in Texas, we did identify that pretty early on, about 5 or 6 years ago now, and we're able to pass legislation to get the HHSC to put law enforcement together, to get some training for these officers, to get these NGOs together to say, look, we needed to get some programs for these young girls to rehabilitate them. How in the world do you ever get them back to normal life after something like this? We needed more facilities, more beds, more training. And so I'm proud to say that in Texas, we actually did take the lead on that. One of my favorites was in the town of Waco. Waco had you mentioned 3 things: going after the perpetrators, going after the demand, the money, and then, of course, helping the victims. Well, in the town of Waco had a way of dealing with the Johns. What they did was when someone was arrested in Waco, they would put that John's picture on the billboard in the city with the headline, "Arrested for Solicitation of Prostitution." Now, that'll ruin your family life at home and in a little town like Waco. And so we took some lessons from that to say, look, we're going after the demand, after the Johns, and to try to dry up that money stream. Judge, you ought to be commended. It's been almost a year since the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act was signed into law. This comprehensive legislation tackled a number of issues to combat human trafficking. It took a stand against the seller we've been talking about and the buyer by criminally pressing charges on both for the first time. And it also provided smart solutions to help victims of trafficking get back on their feet. That's what I said from my days in the Texas legislature. They need a program. They need people to understand. They need counseling. Good Lord, how do those young girls ever get back to some semblance of normalcy after something like that? Thanks to the JVTA, states are now incentivized to draft and pass what we call safe harbor legislation, which helps victims of trafficking expunge their criminal records in an effort to start fresh without the ghosts of their past haunting them. Legislation like this also addresses the need for shelter, for more beds, for facilities, for those NGOs, a place for rehabilitation. And as you know, Judge, currently 34 out of the 50 states have versions of safe harbor legislation, which is an increase of 14 states just since the passage of the act. Training on the identification of trafficking victims has also increased within the airline, the hotel, and even in the medical industries. Mr. Speaker, victims of human trafficking are men, women, and children. This is not a victimless crime, I might add. We all have undoubtedly passed these victims in an airport, at a hotel, or maybe even at the fuel station. Until society at large stops sexualizing our children, we will be unable to prevent the predator's interest in our minors. We've made crucial steps, Mr. Speaker, toward combating human trafficking, as evidenced by the very success of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act we're talking about here tonight. Yet we still have a long way to go to eradicate this scourge of human slavery. But we've got a good start on it, and we're committed to seeing it through the end and making a difference. Mr. Speaker, you know I'm right. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas in his comments. Several important comments that you made about facilities to take the victims once they are rescued by law enforcement or by nonprofit organization. Mr. Speaker, there's no place to put them. And sometimes that is why the police arrest these young girls and put them in juvenile detention, is because there's no facility to take them. And I'm not blaming the police. That's just they have no other place for them to go. There's been some studies done on how many beds are available for trafficked victims. The latest comes out of the state of Illinois, did some research, and there are about 600 to 700 beds nationwide for trafficked victims. 600 to 700 beds. That's it. In a country of 350 million people. You know, compare that to Animal shelters. I love animal shelters. I got 3 Dalmatians. I call them the weapons of mass destruction. And I got one of them from a Dalmatian rescue in Dallas. But there are 5,000 animal shelters in the United States, and that's good. We need every one of them. 600 to 700 beds for trafficking victims. That's not near enough. So that's one thing this legislation does. It provides resources so that we can have places to take these crime victims. And that's what they are. There are victims of crime. They're not criminals. And they're hard to deal with. They're not easy to help. They've had their whole lives destroyed in front of them. And so it takes time, takes facilities, it takes resources. One other comment you made about the signs. Of course, I'm a big fan of criminals carrying signs in front of the businesses that they commit crimes in. I did that as a judge and some other things. And you're exactly right. If we could add an amendment to this legislation, I think we should, give federal judges the option to allow the posting in the county in which the crime was committed on a billboard or a sign of the photograph of the child molester who has been convicted of trafficking children. That would get the attention of some of those folks out there who are trying to hide their criminal conduct. And maybe those billboards ought to pop up right before some big sporting event that cities have as well. That's just a thought, Mr. Speaker. I think we ought to work on that. We also have with us another person who has worked on this whole issue of victims, of trafficked victims and justice for them. Mr. Yoho is one of our newer members of Congress. Ted Yoho from the 3rd District of the state of Florida. And I'll yield to the gentleman 5 minutes at this time.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Texas. You wouldn't have hurt my feelings if you would have said one of the younger members from, but that wouldn't have been true. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in solidarity with the growing army that is fighting human trafficking worldwide. I rise to speak out against this heinous crime known as human trafficking, the scourge of our time in the 21st century, a $32 billion industry. The statistics are overwhelming, as we have heard all the estimates of over 22 million people being trafficked worldwide. Sometimes, though, they seem far away. It's estimated that the individuals in the adult entertainment are often victims of human trafficking. People in farm camps, people in domestic servitude. There are people being trafficked for human body parts. And it goes on every day. People often say that kind of stuff happens overseas, or that doesn't happen here. There's an acronym called NIMBY, not in my backyard. People don't think this happens. No, it happens in our own backyards. It happens here at home. It happens in your state, in your county, and more than likely, it happens in your town. Human trafficking happens as we speak. Human trafficking knows no skin color, no gender, no socioeconomic background. It only knows how to exploit, abuse, and victimize. Who's guilty of this? Well, nation states are guilty of this. Criminal gangs, drug cartels, people needing labor, and terrorist organizations. People are doing this for greed, profit, and power, and they're the scum of humanity, the people that are involved in this. ISIS, as we all know today, they traffic people for terrorist reasons. They sell children from 1 to 9 years of age, 1 to 9 years of age, bring the most for ISIS, $168. Young women between 19 and 18, they've dropped in value. They're worth $128. ISIS even gives away slaves for rewards of deeds that we deem are bad deeds. The alarming estimate of more than 1 million teenagers run away every year in the United States. Runaways are the most at-risk youth and susceptible of trafficking. Runaways are the most at risk when they leave. In fact, runaways are typically picked up by the pimps or traffickers within the first 48 hours. Who does this sort of thing? Well, the perpetrators aren't of a certain stereotype. They're of all backgrounds. I don't want to name any backgrounds, but they're people of low, no, and high profiles. This year in my hometown of Gainesville, a trafficking ring was discovered and 6 people were arrested. Last week, a person of high profile, one of the leaders of the Black Life Movement, was arrested for sexually trafficking a minor in New York. Just last year, a 15-year-old girl was discovered by police in a motel room being sexually abused and trafficked several times a day. When I say several times a day, we're talking 15 to 20 times a day. Their body is being sold like an amusement ride. Her parents had been handing out missing child flyers in the neighborhood when somebody recognized her picture from an online ad. That young girl went from being a runaway to a trafficking victim in less than a month. That 15-year-old girl could be the son or daughter of yours, your friends, could be your niece, nephew, your brother or sister. However, it's not just runaways that become victims of trafficking. Traffickers don't discriminate based on economic class, race, gender, or age. Traffickers are motivated by profit. The average cost of a slave worldwide is less than $90. That's the value the scum of the earth puts on the value of a human's life. As the world's fastest growing and 3rd largest criminal enterprise, it's shocking how little people know about this horrendous practice. Further, it's appalling how little it puts towards the effort to stop it. In my district, we've created the North Central Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, which is aimed at bringing together community partners from the federal, state, and local levels to combat trafficking. For many, education and awareness is half the battle. We teamed up with the Department of Homeland Security and used their Blue campaign to raise awareness. This week here on Capitol Hill, we celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the Justice for Victims Trafficking Act, sponsored by Judge Ted Poe out of Texas, and I'm a proud co-sponsor of this important legislation and thank my colleagues for their support of this bill as well. This issue, the issue of human trafficking, is not a Republican or Democratic issue. Back in January, several of us took to this very House floor to speak of the horrors of this crime. But taking a stand on one particular day or highlighting the issue once a month doesn't even begin to cover what the victims experience on a daily basis or the horrors and nightmares they have for a lifetime. We must always, always be vigilant and active in our fight because awareness and education, just one other person to know what the signs are, we can help end this horrific tragedy. Mr. Speaker, no neighborhood is immune, no city is exempt. These slaves or victims are a part of our daily lives, quietly suffering, but being traded like livestock and treated beyond comprehension. We cannot, in good conscience, continue our daily routines without making every effort to stamp out the practice of forced labor, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, or the selling of body parts. Whether you're a college student, business owner, or a stay-at-home parent, we all play a role. But first, I ask my colleagues to stand with me as we take another step in taking down trafficking. Thank you to all those, both here, at home, and abroad, that are fighting every day to make this modern-day slavery a thing of the past. All it takes for evil to succeed is for good men, women, or people to do nothing. Finally, thank you to my colleague, Mr. Poe from Texas, for hosting this special order, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. Appreciate your comments. Several excellent points that you made. The NIMBY attitude that some people have, not in my backyard. I met with a father last week. He came to my office, and he told me the story of how his daughter had been trafficked. And he went to the local sheriff in another part of the state and told the sheriff what had happened, and the sheriff said, "It doesn't happen here." It does. It happens everywhere. It is in our backyard. It is everywhere. And we need to recognize that. The gentleman worked on his own then to find his daughter and take her back home. And a gentleman from Florida makes another good comment about how these young kids are prey. A trafficked child, like this one I just mentioned, they had been working on her for 18 months, seducing her, talking to her, using the internet, and people that she thought were her friends. They were not her friends. They were all involved in the trafficking process. And we need to understand that traffickers are not old guys in trench coats wandering around snatching kids. They're not. Many times they're young people, young good-looking guys that will strike up a conversation with a middle schooler at the mall and then talk to him again later, and then later. And then finally that individual gets in the vehicle or meets the individual, the trafficker, someplace, and then she's gone. And this father that I talked to, he knew the statistics that if you have a child that's in the that's trafficked, you have about 3 weeks to find her, or she's gone. Because those traffickers move those kids all over the country, selling them every day. It's in our backyard, unfortunately. And I also want to recognize another Texan, the gentlelady from Houston, Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, who has worked on this issue of trafficking here and also back home in our hometown of Houston. So I'll yield to the gentlelady 5 minutes.
Let me thank the gentleman from Texas for his persistence, determination, and for this exciting commemoration of the Justice for All Reauthorization Act of 2016. And let me thank the Victims' Rights Caucus and co-chair Jim Costa, along with Congressman Poe, Judge Poe, who famously has said, and that's the way it is. And I see all of us are seemingly adopting those words. So you have now put the English language in the form that we just can't help ourselves. So Judge Poe, thank you so very much. I remember his beginning, and I want to thank him for a year or two ago when he joined me and Chairman McCall for a Homeland Security human trafficking hearing in Houston, Texas. I believe we have had other hearings since then because we know that Houston, Texas, Harris County, and in Texas has been called one of the center points of human trafficking to our dismay. And so many stories have come to our attention. I think it was about 2 years ago, Judge Poe, when they found a stash house out in the county. I actually went to that site where teams of, when I say teams, tens upon tens of individuals, including children, were in that particular place. We had to shut down a cantina in and around the inner city that had been used for human trafficking in the city of Houston. The one point that is very important that I will make and comment on some other aspects that are in this bill is that human trafficking is profitable. Human trafficking is profitable. And that means that slavery is not dead. Human trafficking is profitable. And the reason is because tragically, the young child, the young teenager, the preteen, the young woman, or maybe the young man, the boy, is recycled tragically over and over again, which makes the human trafficker more than profitable and vicious and vile, because they have to keep that human being who needs to be free and enjoy the freedom of being a child and enjoy the various special things of being a child, being loved and nurtured, going to picnics, going to school. They have to keep that child, that young woman, that young man in bondage. And that's what this bill has spoken to previously, and certainly among other things, that is what it speaks to today. In the many bills that were incorporated in this bill, it was to eliminate, if you will, eliminate the pain and viciousness of human trafficking. Let me quickly say that I want to congratulate the fact that this bill has that reduces rape kit backlog and provides resources for forensic labs in cities all over America. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, we were hearing the stories about backlog rape kits. And so this bill requires at least 75% of amounts made available to the DOJ for forensic testing to be used for direct testing of crime scene evidence, including rape kits. Improves the sexual assault nurse examiner program by incentivizing the hiring of full-time nurses, particularly in rural and underserved areas. And reauthorizes and improves the Paul Coverdale Forensic Sciences Improvement Grants, which awards grants to states and local governments to improve the quality of forensic science services, so very important. They also say that this Justice for All acknowledges, or I acknowledge, that in numerous studies have also shown that at least 75% of youth involved in the justice system have experienced traumatic victimization, making them vulnerable to mental health disorders and perceived behavioral noncompliance and misconduct. And so this legislation deals with best evidence research to be able to help our youth as well, and to ensure that they get the kind of treatment they need, particularly after sexual assault, which is what human trafficking mostly is, besides the heinousness of being held by another human being. So I'm very glad that we are moving forward on the reauthorization for Justice for All for 2016. So many things have been made better. I want to cite one example as I close. I'm reminded of this because of the floods that we dealt with recently, and there were incidences of women living in places where their name was not on the lease. And so, for example, if a man gets evicted for abusing his living girlfriend, the girlfriend who is not a named tenant on the lease but is a resident would not automatically be evicted. That's so very important. Many times that girlfriend is living there with her children. She would be permitted to stay for a reasonable time to establish her own eligibility to remain in the public housing unit. Let me say this. This is not a one-size-fits-all, but it's not a one community. It's not any race of people. It's not any economic level of people. It is people who are egregiously abusing and violating another human being. And in many instances, Judge Poe, it is a child. So I want to thank you for this legislation. Let us continue to walk this pathway together in a bipartisan manner. Certainly, as a very valued member of the Judiciary Committee, a lot of your work is part of that legislative agenda, and I'm very glad to join in. And a lot of your work is on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So thank you so very much. Let us work together to save lives and to protect our children. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentlelady for her comments. And as the gentlelady knows, and it's been mentioned on the House floor, I think by Mr. Weber, Houston, Texas is a hub for child sex trafficking in the United States. And it's because of our location. And we're using that, though, to change the dynamics of the city. Yeah. Working with our new mayor, Sylvester Turner, who was in the state legislature for a long time, our new mayor has now come up with a protocol for the city of Houston to work to eliminate this scourge. And I think it's a protocol that now cities throughout the country will be able to use themselves to address the issue, admit the problem, and then deal with it on a multi-layer basis, working with all the nonprofits and all the government agencies and different types of law enforcement. So I know that you're working with the mayor on this project, and I want to congratulate you and the mayor for taking this issue and solving it. So Houston now will be an example of what to do in solving this scourge. I also want to thank you for being on the Victims' Rights Caucus. As you mentioned, it's bipartisan. Jim Costa and I started this in 2005. There are 80 members, 40 Republicans, 40 Democrats.
Great.
And the Victims' Rights Caucus, Mr. Speaker, promotes victims of crime before Congress.
Judge Poe, if you would yield just for a moment so I could add my voice of expressing my appreciation to be a member of the Victims' Rights Caucus, because it is bipartisan, and it's multi-communities, all different people. And let me thank the chairman for mentioning Mayor Turner. This is an exciting effort. If you don't take notice, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. And that's what the city is doing, is taking notice, putting in infrastructure to be helpful. But let me close by simply saying, Judge Poe, as you well know, over the last couple of days in Houston, we have been mourning the killing of an 11-year-old child on his way home from school. Now, we have not determined who it is, but all I can say to you is, when our children are vulnerable, whether by a heinous individual that would maybe was trying to use this child, maybe was trying to pick the child up. We don't know, but the child is now deceased. My sympathy to his family. They're in my congressional district, the Flores family. And all I can say is that it is our responsibility to protect these children, and not for little Husu to have died in vain in this tragic way that he lost his life. Again, thank you for allowing me to offer sympathy to his family and to his community and say that we're doing the right thing by trying to protect those who are most vulnerable. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and you're exactly correct. That's really what we're supposed to be doing, is helping those that are the least fortunate, the most vulnerable in our community, and there's no more vulnerable people than kids and children. So I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Speaker, I also want to recognize numerous members of Congress who have worked on all this legislation. Before I do that, though, I want to recognize a person on my staff, Blair Bagelos, who is leaving the Hill and going to work for one of these groups that's trying to save the world, which is great. They are. Victims Group. She's worked for me for almost 6 years, and she's my victim advocate. I think I'm the only member of Congress that has a victim advocate that's what they do, is work on victims' issues, and she was a large part responsible for drafting this legislation, Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. And I want to thank her publicly for the work she's done in the victims movement, working on the Victims' Rights Caucus, this legislation, the other victims' issues as well. Fortunate to have a person like that who is so passionate to work and trying to help those that are most vulnerable in our community, and that's victims of crime. So I want to thank her for doing that. I want to mention some other members of Congress and just put in the record some of the things they have been doing. It's not all of them, but in limited time, I'm going to mention the ones I can. 2 members, bipartisan, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, Renee Elmers and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, introduced the Trafficking Awareness Training for Health Care Act. And remember, Mr. Speaker, all these bills were combined, passed the House, go to the Senate. The Senate, with Senator Cornyn and Senator Wyden, combined them into one bill, came back to the House after it passed the Senate and then signed by the presidents. Also, Eric Paulson, a Republican, and Representative Gwen Moore, a Democrat, introduced the Stop Exploitation Through Trafficking Act. Joe Heck, who was going to be here tonight to speak from Nevada, introduced Enhancing Services for Runaway and Homeless Youth Victims of Trafficking. Ann Wagner, that has been mentioned already. She introduced the SAVE Act. Mark Walker, Human Trafficking Detection Act. Kristi Noem, Human Trafficking Prevention, Intervention, and Recovery Act. Tom Marino and Karen Bass, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, Strengthening Child Welfare Response for Human Trafficking. Joyce Beatty, who has spoken here tonight, also worked with Ann Wagner and then also introduced Improving Response for Victims of Child Sex Trafficking Act. And Sean Maloney introduced the Human Trafficking Prevention Act. Lots of individuals, lots of folks who helped in the House. And then we had support from over 200 organizations throughout the country trying to get this legislation passed. And some of those: Rights for Girls, Coalition Against Trafficking of Women, Shared Hope International, End Child Prostitution and Trafficking in the USA, National Children's Alliance, National Association to Protect Children, Equality Now, National Conference of State Legislatures, and the National Criminal Justice Association. We're all on the same page in the hymnal, singing the same song, Mr. Speaker, and that song is that we are going to do everything we can to stop this scourge of human trafficking. We want those folks to know that traffic young children, they have no place to hide. And those customers that buy those kids, they have no place to hide. There is no safe place for them. And we want victims to know there is a safe place, that we will help them and help them to recover from what has happened to them, and hold people accountable for what they do, especially when they commit crimes against the most vulnerable people in our culture. And if we're not to help kids, why are we here, Mr. Speaker? And I want to thank members of Congress for passing this legislation overwhelming. Many of these bills passed the House unanimously. That doesn't happen a lot over here. And we're all working on this. We're not through, but we want people to know, victims of crime, there's hope and there's rescue, and that's just the way it is, Mr. Speaker.